In the vastness of space, two planets floated like eternal rivals. Solaris, the blue planet, glimmered with its cobalt seas and crystalline skies, while Verdaris, the green planet, shone with its lush emerald jungles and verdant landscapes. These twin planets orbited two stars, locked in a cosmic dance that mirrored the tense relationship between their inhabitants. The people of Zaloris were known for their advanced technology, their society built on crystal spires that rose high into the sky, reflecting the light of their twin suns. At the heart of this civilization was King Talar, a proud and fierce ruler whose skin was as deep a blue as the oceans of his world. He had led his people through countless wars with Verdaris, always emerging victorious, yet the cost of these wars had taken a toll on him. His eyes, once sharp and filled with ambition, now held the weight of an unending conflict. Verdaris, by contrast, was a world where nature reigned supreme. The Verdarans lived in harmony with their planet, building their cities to blend seamlessly with the forests, rivers, and mountains that surrounded them. Their ruler, Queen Leora, was as much a guardian of the land as she was of her people. Her emerald green skin matched the jungles of Verdaris, and her wisdom was legendary. She had ruled with a delicate balance, always seeking peace. But war with Zolaris seemed inevitable. The two planets had been at odds for centuries. While the Solari valued innovation and expansion, the Verdarans cherished preservation and harmony with nature. Both planets viewed the other as a threat to their way of life, and the bitter rivalry had only intensified over the years. Amidst this ancient conflict were two figures whose fates would soon become intertwined: Kale, the son of King Talar, and Leora, the daughter of Queen Leora. Kale had been raised to lead, trained in the art of war from a young age. His deep blue skin and piercing eyes made him a symbol of Zalaris' strength, and though he was a fierce warrior, he harbored doubts about the endless cycle of violence. Leora, on the other hand, had grown up amidst the beauty and peace of Verdaris, but she too had been shaped by the war. As the heir to her mother's throne, Leora was as intelligent as she was strong-willed. Her emerald green eyes reflected the wisdom of her people, and like Kale, she had begun to question the purpose of the endless fighting. Both were bound by their duty to their families and their planets, but neither could ignore the growing weariness within their hearts. Little did they know their fates were about to collide in a way that would change everything. The tense relationship between Zolaris and Verdaris had reached a breaking point. Both planets had agreed to meet on neutral ground in one last attempt at diplomacy before the war reignited. The chosen location was a moon, a desolate place that had seen too much bloodshed in past conflicts but now served as the setting for negotiations. Kale accompanied his father, King Thaler, to the meeting, just as Leora stood by her mother's side. As they entered the negotiation chamber, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Every word spoken between the leaders was laced with suspicion, every glance a subtle accusation. As the talks progressed, it became clear that peace was unlikely. Accusations flew back and forth, each side blaming the other for past transgressions. But while their parents argued, Cal's eyes fell upon Leora. She was not what he had imagined. He had grown up hearing stories of the Greenons as wild, dangerous beings. But Leora was composed, intelligent, and fiercely dignified. There was something in her gaze that stirred something deep within him. Leora, too, noticed Kale. She had been taught to hate the Blue Wands, to see them as aggressors and destroyers of life. But when she looked into Kale's eyes, she saw not a monster, but a young man burdened by the same struggle she carried. Their worlds had painted them as enemies, yet here, in this chamber filled with hostility, something inexplicable passed between them, a connection neither could deny. The negotiations ended in failure. As expected, both rulers stormed out, their tempers flaring, and the threat of war hung heavier than ever. Yet Kale and Leora had both seen something that their elders could not, a glimmer of hope, a reason to believe that perhaps their worlds didn't need to be enemies. As they parted ways, Kale and Leora shared one final glance, one that silently promised this would not be their last meeting. In the days following the failed diplomatic attempt, both Zolaris and Verdaris began preparing for the inevitable war. Tensions were higher than ever, and the air on both planets was thick with anxiety. Soldiers were called to arms, weapons were readied, and battle strategies were drawn up. The drums of war were beating once again. Kale tried to focus on his duties as a warrior and prince, but he found his thoughts constantly returning to Leora. Her emerald eyes, her quiet strength, and the undeniable connection they had shared haunted him. He knew it was wrong, she was the enemy, after all, but deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more between them, something powerful. On Verdaris, Leora was struggling with the same feelings. She had spent her entire life being told that the Blue Wands were their greatest threat, that their only goal was destruction and conquest. But Kale, he didn't fit that image. There was a softness in his eyes, a depth of emotion that contradicted everything she had been taught. Unable to resist any longer, Leora decided to take a risk. She sent a secret message to Kale using an old, nearly forgotten communication channel that had once been used during the early days of diplomacy between their planets. It was encrypted, and she knew that if it were discovered, the consequences would be dire. Kyle received the message late in the night. His heart raced as he read it, knowing that this could be a trap. But something inside him told him that it wasn't. Leora wouldn't do that. And so against his better judgment, he sent a reply agreeing to the meeting. The moon of Veralis, located between their two planets, had once been a place of neutral diplomacy, but was now abandoned, scarred by the wars that had ravaged it. Its barren surface was dotted with craters and remnants of old battlefields, a grim reminder of the cost of conflict. When Kale arrived, he found Leora already waiting. She stood alone in the shadow of a massive crater, her green skin illuminated by the pale light of the distant stars. For a moment, neither spoke. They simply stood there, staring at each other, the weight of their worlds pressing down on them. Finally, Leora broke the silence. "We can't keep doing this," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Our planets. This war. It has to end." Kale nodded, his throat tight. "I know. But how?" And yet, they couldn't stop. They wouldn't stop. For in each other, they saw a chance for peace, a chance to end the war that had plagued their people for so long. Despite the growing bond between Kale and Leora, the war between Zolaris and Verdaris escalated. Both planets had reached the point of no return, and battle fleets were mobilizing. Tensions rose as the leaders on both sides prepared for all-out war. Kale was called to lead the Zolarians into battle, while Leora, back on Verdaris, was expected to advise her mother on military strategies. The burden on both of them was heavy, and the weight of their secret meetings pressed on their minds constantly. Despite the war closing in around them, they continued to meet in secret on the moon of Veralis. Each time, the danger of being discovered increased, but so did their determination to find a way to stop the conflict. Their love for each other deepened with each encounter, and with it grew the conviction that they could bring peace. But as the war intensified, so did the suspicion from those around them. Kyle's father, King Talar, began to question his son's focus. He noticed the changes in Kale, the hesitation in his eyes whenever the war was discussed. Leora, too, was being watched closely by her mother, who sensed that something was amiss. To be continued in the next chapters. I will continue writing from this point. Let me know if you're enjoying the story so far. The war between Zolaris and Verdaris had now reached its tipping point. Both planets had mobilized their armies, preparing for what many believed would be the final and most devastating confrontation. The skies above Zolaris hummed with the sound of warships, their sleek forms cutting through the atmosphere, while on Verdaris, the lush jungles were cleared to make way for advanced weaponry that had never before been used in combat. Despite the overwhelming pressure from their respective rulers and the imminent war, Kale and Leora continued their secret meetings. Each encounter became riskier, but their determination only grew stronger. They had begun to exchange not only words of affection but also strategies, whispered plans of how they could use their positions of influence to steer the war in a different direction. Yet time was running out. Kale's burden. Kale found himself at the heart of Solaris' military machine. As the eldest son of King Thaler, it was his duty to lead the Zolarian forces into battle. His father had entrusted him with commanding one of the most significant fleet groups in Zolaris history, a sign of immense trust but also a burden that Kale did not want to carry. Each time he donned his armor, his deep blue skin gleaming under the artificial lights of the military base, Kale felt the weight of his betrayal pressing down on him. How could he lead his people into a war that he no longer believed in? How could he fight against the Verdarans, knowing that the woman he loved was on the other side? His father, King Talar, had noticed the changes in his son. Over the past few months, Kale had grown quieter, more introspective. Though he remained outwardly loyal and competent, there was a hesitation in his eyes that had never been there before. One evening, Thaler confronted Kale in the grand hall of Zeloria's palace. The towering crystal columns cast long shadows as the two figures stood in silence for a moment, the tension palpable. Kale Thaler began, his voice heavy with authority. "I have led our people through countless wars, and I have never doubted the cause. But you, there is doubt in your eyes. What has changed?" Kale struggled to find the right words. "Father, I do not question our people, nor do I question you. But this war, it feels different. It feels endless." Thaler's eyes narrowed, the intensity of his gaze cutting through Kale's defenses. "War is never easy, my son, but it is necessary. The Verdarans are a threat to everything we have built. You will understand this better when you sit on the throne." Kale nodded, knowing that to reveal his true feelings or worse, his relationship with Leora would not only endanger him but also her. "I understand," he replied, though the words felt hollow. Leora's dilemma. Back on Verdaris, Leora faced her own struggle. Her mother, Queen Leora, had always ruled with wisdom and compassion, but now she was preparing for war. Leora was torn between her duty to her people and her secret love for Kale. She had tried to sway her mother, to make her see that there could be another way, but the queen was firm in her resolve. One evening, as Leora stood on a balcony overlooking the vast emerald forests of Verdaris, her mother approached her. Queen Leora, with her regal posture and piercing green eyes, seemed to sense the turmoil within her daughter. "Leora," she said softly, "you've been distant. I know you are troubled by the war, but we have no choice. The Zolari will never stop unless we fight back." Leora turned to face her mother, struggling to keep her emotions in check. "What if there is another way?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Leora sighed. "We've tried diplomacy. We've tried peace. And what has it gotten us? More death, more destruction. We must protect Verdaris at any cost." Leora knew that her mother's words came from a place of love for their people, but she couldn't help feeling that there was a different path. "I just wish things were different," she murmured, her thoughts drifting to Kale. Despite their best efforts to keep their meetings a secret, Kale and Leora's growing closeness did not go unnoticed. There were always eyes and ears, especially in times of war, and suspicion began to creep into the ranks of both planets' leadership. It was during one of their secret meetings on the moon of Veralis that disaster struck. Kale and Leora had been discussing their next move, a risky plan to try and broker a secret ceasefire through a faction of rebels on both planets who were tired of the war. As they spoke, Kale noticed movement in the distant shadows shifting among the craters of the moon. His heart raced. "We've been discovered," he whispered urgently, grabbing Leora's hand. "We have to leave," but it was too late. A group of Zilurian soldiers, led by one of Kale's trusted officers, appeared over the ridge. Their faces were filled with shock and betrayal as they saw their prince standing with the enemy. Kale, the officer named Jorik, shouted, "What is this?" "A meeting with the enemy." Kale stepped forward, trying to defuse the situation. "Jorik, listen to me. This isn't what it looks like. I'm trying to end the war," but Jorik's eyes were hard. "You've betrayed us. You've betrayed Solaris." Before Kale could react, Jorik raised his communicator and sent a message back to Solaris. The secret was out. The consequences, the discovery of Kale and Leora's relationship sent shockwaves through both planets. On Zolaris, King Thaler was furious. His own son, consorting with the enemy. It was a betrayal unlike any other. Kale was immediately stripped of his command and imprisoned, his fate uncertain. On Verdaris, Queen Leora was heartbroken. She had always trusted her daughter, but now Leora's secret relationship with Kale threatened to destroy everything she had fought to protect. Leora, too, was imprisoned, accused of treason against her people. The war, which had already been escalating, now reached new heights. Both planets prepared for the final confrontation, with neither side willing to back down. The love between Kale and Leora, which had once been a secret hope for peace, now seemed to be the spark that would ignite the greatest battle of all. But not all was lost. Despite Kale and Leora's imprisonment, there were those on both planets who saw their love not as a betrayal, but as a symbol of hope. A group of rebels, made up of soldiers and civilians from both Solaris and Verdaris, began to rise in secret. They were tired of the endless war, tired of watching their families and friends die for a cause that seemed pointless. The rebel group, led by a former Solarian general named Relin and a Verdaran diplomat named Ithara, saw in Kale and Leora the possibility of something greater: peace. They began to spread whispers among the people, telling stories of the forbidden love between the Prince of Zolaris and the Princess of Verdaris, and how their love could be the key to ending the war. Relin and Ithara managed to free Kale and Leora from their respective prisons, smuggling them out in the dead of night and bringing them to a secret location, a hidden base on a distant asteroid, far from the watchful eyes of the warring planets. From their hidden base, Kale and Leora, along with Relin and Ithara, began to coordinate their plan to end the war. It would not be easy. Both Solaris and Verdaris were on the brink of total war, and their parents were determined to see the conflict through to the bitter end. But Kale and Leora had one final chance to stop the bloodshed. They planned a daring mission to infiltrate the command centers of both planets and confront their parents directly. It was a dangerous gambit, but it was the only way they could hope to bring about peace. With the help of the rebels, they were able to sneak back onto their planets. Kale returned to Zolaris, where he confronted his father in the war room. The sight of his son standing before him after being branded a traitor shocked King Thaler. "Father, this war must end," Kale said firmly. "I love Leora, and I know you won't understand, but we can't keep fighting like this." Thaler was silent for a long moment, his eyes searching his son's face. He had always been a proud and stubborn man, but in that moment he saw the truth in Kale's words. "You risk everything for this love." "Yes," Kale replied, his voice steady. "Because it's worth more than this war." Meanwhile, on Verdaris, Leora made her own stand. She confronted her mother in the heart of the palace, pleading with her to see reason. "Mother, the war is destroying us. We can't keep doing this. I love Kale, and together we can end this." Queen Leora, like Thaler, was torn. Her duty to her people weighed heavily on her, but the love and conviction in her daughter's eyes were undeniable. The leaders of Zachararis and Verdaris, swayed by their children's courage and the rising support from the rebel factions, agreed to a ceasefire. The war that had raged for centuries finally came to an end. Kale and Leora's love became a symbol of unity between the two planets. In a grand ceremony, they were married, their union sealing the peace between Solaris and Verdaris. It was not just a wedding, but a new beginning for both planets, a moment of reconciliation and hope. As part of the peace agreement, there was a symbolic exchange between the two planets, a tradition revived from ancient times. Women from both Solaris and Verdaris exchanged places, not as prisoners or hostages, but as ambassadors of friendship and cooperation, further solidifying the bond between the two worlds. Kael and Leora became the rulers of both planets, their reign marked by a new era of peace, prosperity, and unity. They had overcome the hatred and fear that had divided their worlds, proving that love truly could conquer all. And so, the story of the Blue Prince and the Green Princess ended not with war, but with hope and the promise of a future where their two planets, once bitter enemies, would stand together in peace.